Are you looking to stay ahead of the curve in the latest trends in enterprise tech? Look no further than the Breaking Analysis podcast with Dave Vellante. This data-driven program dives into the most important topics facing the enterprise tech industry today. With a data-first approach that leverages ETR's renowned surveys of IT decision-makers and insight from the CUBE community, Breaking Analysis delivers in-depth research on the most important topics facing technologists and IT buyers. Whether you're a business leader, an IT professional, investor, or just an avid follower of the industry, this podcast is a must-listen. Just search Breaking Analysis Podcast wherever you get your podcast and tune in today to stay ahead of the game in enterprise tech.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to the Cloudcast. We're coming to you live from our massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. And it is Aaron for Cloud News. Now, as has been the trend here recently, we got a lot of cloud news. So there is an extensive list of cloud news links in the show notes this week. But we're going to choose the top three. We're going to go through them quickly, and then we're going to jump into our guest after the break. Starting off for our first article for cloud news this week, Jam and Ball, our good friend over at Cloud at Judgment, hot off the press. Look back at Q2 public cloud software earnings. Now, I will simply say this. We've talked about his reports many times on Cloud News. This one is definitely worth looking into, and quite frankly, it's too long for me to really go into. It in itself could probably be an episode of the Cloudcast. But just wanted everyone to pay attention to that and definitely go give that a look. And for our second article, this is something we thought maybe was going to happen, and that is OpenTF, of course, the Open Terraform project. It forked, and of course, HashiCorp changed their license to the BSL license, and OpenTF kind of threatened to do this, and then finally, they just went ahead and did it. Now, one thing that was super interesting was the folks in charge of the project was their view is they didn't actually fork the project because they're just changing the name because it's the same project under the same license. They're actually saying HashiCorp is the ones that are forking everything because they're the ones that changed and went to a different license with their own project. Yeah. Kind of a fun rebuttal to all of this, but at the end of the day, you now have two very different projects potentially going forward in the community. And for our third announcement for Cloud News this week, CNCF put out a report last week, the State of WebAssembly 2023. I didn't actually get a chance to read this one yet. It's in my queue to probably read later this week, but CNCF always does a fantastic job with these projects, with these reports, and really looking forward to digging into that. And of course, WebAssembly continues to be a very hot area and an area of interest. So with that, I'm going to wrap up Cloud News. And again, just a reminder, there is probably another 6 or 7 links at least that I didn't go into in Cloud News. There's one on IDP, reference architectures. There's how Google is leveraging generative AI. There's an article about IBM and rolling out their new AI features and models, and some more AI things in there, including Hugging Face introducing training as a service, which actually was really interesting. But we're going to wrap up Cloud News. And coming up after the break, we're going to be talking about automating developer security and compliance with Matt Spitz, head of engineering at Vanta.
Today's show is sponsored by Panoptica. Panoptica simplifies container deployment, monitoring, and security, protecting the entire application stack from build to runtime. Scalable across clusters and multi-cloud environments, Panoptica secures containers, serverless APIs, and Kubernetes with a unified view, reducing operational complexity and promoting collaboration by integrating with commonly used developer, SRE, and SecOps tools. Panoptica ensures compliance with regulatory mandates and CIS benchmarks for best practice conformity. Privacy teams can monitor API traffic and identify sensitive data while identifying open source components vulnerable to attacks that require patching. Proactively addressing security issues with Panoptica allows businesses to focus on mitigating critical risks and protecting their interest. Learn more about Panoptica today at panoptica.app. That's panoptica.app.
And we're back, and something we've decided to really kind of continue to focus on this year is definitely this concept of developers, but also more a little bit digging into security and compliance as this becomes certainly more mainstream and a topic we're getting more and more feedback on. So with that, we're going to dig right in. Today we have Matt Spitz, head of engineering at Vanta. And so first of all, Matt, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. And please tell everyone just a little bit about your background. What made you join Vanta, and did your experience at Dropbox, for example, factor into this decision ultimately where you're headed?
Yeah, for sure. So I had what I think is not a terribly unique arc in my own career development as a software engineer. I started focusing mostly on craft, things like distributed systems, machine learning, but the early 2010s definition of machine learning before neural networks were really that feasible at scale. Did some mobile development too. That brought me into focusing more about customer problems and product engineering. And eventually, as I developed my skills and learned more about the businesses, that focus transitioned to business problems also and leadership roles and things like that. So I worked at a bunch of different sizes and scales of companies, from joining a startup to joining a startup that got acquired by a big company to starting a company, something in a hypergrowth stage like Dropbox, where I spent the last 6 years of my career before taking the head of engineering role at Vanta.
Fantastic.
And I think one thing that's interesting to say about that is that in my role at Dropbox, I got to interact with the business trade-offs and challenges that come with security. And the business is obviously trying to move forward. And in my group in particular, we were trying to develop new products and services for customers that were sort of adjacent to Dropbox's existing value proposition. And so there's a lot of like rapid iteration and rapid development and experimentation and betas and things like that, and sort of building things and testing them out without having them be like fully baked at Dropbox's scale. And I had an eye-opening moment with the Dropbox security team and working with them, in that, we're shipping some brand new thing to some customers that may present risk to the security or the integrity of the data that they store in Dropbox, just because we're touching the stuff and we're moving fast. And the security team found ways to say yes rather than found ways to say no. Instead of security, which is sometimes painted as a culture of no, they really painted the decision in terms of the trade-offs around, like, if the risk of the number of customers we were sharing it with, or the risk of the types of things we were doing, and sort of gave me good frameworks and guardrails of how to think about that, as opposed to, this stuff is customer data and you haven't gone through like onerous review process, then absolutely not. And that really opened my eyes to working with good security and sort of how that plays into business trade-offs and business problems as well.
Yeah. And so it's funny because when you started to tell that story, in my head, I was already kind of going down the path of the stereotypical of like, you were trying to go fast, as you said. And most developers, like, that's the end of the day, what they want to do. They want to go fast. And then security comes along and is like, wait a second, you can't do that. Right. And so that is like, obviously feeds into this larger topic today, but is that typically the biggest problem we're facing of developers want to go fast in security and compliance? If they are brought in, it can be Department of No kind of thing? Or is it like, hey, they're brought in, but they're brought in super late as an afterthought? Like, tell everyone a little bit about the hurdles, the friction, and where the problems ultimately lie a lot of the times.
I think this has evolved a lot in the last 5 to 10 years. I think some of this is just an evolving understanding of how to practice better security. And some of it is an evolution of the nature of security today, moving from physical security and securing filing cabinets versus securing cloud infrastructure, or securing people's access to data that doesn't live in the company's physical control. And I think from a cultural perspective, one of the things that we've learned is that if you sort of see security as this black and white, where there are either issues or you have a completely, either you have a completely pristine, clear record or there's no issues at all, that's just not realistic. And when security acts as a partner to the business rather than the department of no, then employees at the company feel comfortable surfacing potential security threats, even ones that they created themselves or were involved in, because they feel comfortable bringing those problems to security and knowing that their head isn't going to get chopped off in doing so. And by having a sort of like more reasoned and productive trade-off about potential issues that exist and the material trade-offs that come with them, you end up with like a much more mature security culture. And so I think the problem then is like, how can you invest in the digital systems and digital assets, securing those things in a way that's sort of foundational to the beginning of the company, and investing in the beginning of the security culture of the company, such that you can have a sort of like healthy, productive conversation around it, rather than a sort of binary black and white, not security is bad, security is the sayer of no, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I think it really feeds into this evolving theme or story that we're kind of really talking about here of like, how do we enable developers to go faster, but at the same time do it in a way that's both secure and compliant. And like we said, developers like to go fast, right? A lot of times just want to get to the MVP. We want to make sure things work correctly. But at the same time, what are those first steps? And like when you're talking to folks and you're talking about, hey, yes, you can get to that MVP, but you also can build in security and compliance into, say, the CI/CD pipelines, and doing it in a way that's more programmatic and doesn't introduce friction. Like, what has been both your personal experience and what's your recommendation to those out there?
I don't think it's that much of, I don't think those are at odds, by the way, moving fast and doing so in a secure way. And especially as security moves more towards securing digital assets, the security programs and automation is moving more toward investing in automation the right way to be able to do things in a secure way. And those investments that you make in security, and I'll share a couple of examples here, but those investments that you make in security have productivity benefits too. And so, for example, one investment you might make for security's sake is investing early in a repeatable process by which to push code and infrastructure into production via CI/CD. And I think of that in two forms. One is like making your infrastructure predictable using something like infrastructure as code, something like Terraform, where instead of clicking buttons in the AWS console, you are declaring in code what you want your infrastructure to look like, and then syncing that with AWS. So the infrastructure that you want to run in production is code reviewed. There's a change log for it. You can see how that evolves over time in a way that's not looking at an AWS console. And there's security implications for that, because the code that is running in production, like the infrastructure that's running in production, the configuration of that infrastructure may have security concerns, right? Like if you accidentally set a S3 bucket with sensitive information in it to be public, knowing when that happened, when that was pushed to production, et cetera, is meaningful from a security perspective. And being able to have confidence that looking at the code, you can tell exactly what's happening rather than having to sift through the AWS console is meaningful from a security perspective.
Yeah.
It's also meaningful from a productivity perspective, right? Like typically a lot of startups start with like the infra person kind of like clicking all the buttons and figuring it all out. But the context for how and why everything is all set up lives in their head. And the more, as teams scale, especially, like being able to distribute that knowledge effectively is meaningful, and doing so in code is an easy way to do that. The other side of this is like having a push button deployment for CI/CD, where you have a script that runs in something like GitHub Actions or Circle CI that's pushing your code to production rather than running a script on your laptop. Doing so in a repeatable manner has productivity benefits because it's not about how your laptop is configured versus my laptop. It's a clean, again, repeatable way to push code to production. from a security perspective, you can lock down the authorization for who can push that button. There's an audit log for what they pushed and why they pushed it and when they pushed it. And so investments in security are not necessarily at odds with investments in productivity or moving faster. In fact, good investments in security, because you're securing something that is digital, can actually accelerate productivity too.
Yeah, it's a little bit of go slow to go fast, right? A little bit of time up front to build the frameworks and build out the tools and the work streams so that you can go even faster than you could have if you just tried to script from the laptop, like you.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I'm going to take it one step further, though. So security, certainly one angle and something we've been talking about, but just as important, if not more so, is compliance, right? But it adds this, I mean, we kind of always jointly lump them together, but at the same time, I think of them as two very separate things, because compliance can mean so many different things based off of what industry you're in or what geography you're in, like, SOX in the US, for instance, right? And so how do organizations tend to treat this? Do they treat it as the security folks are typically the compliance folks, or do organizations staff for this and you have a staff that specifically keeps up with regulatory changes? Or on the flip side, like, is this an area that a lot of times is understaffed and needs outside assistance? What's been your experience here?
Yeah, so compliance means a lot of different things. And there's different types of regulations that one might be compliant with, or different types of standards that one might be compliant with. And, one differentiation is like security compliance, where there's the compliance framework sort of dictates some best practices or high level things that an organization should adhere to practice good security. And then there's privacy compliance, which is similar but quite different in terms of the sorts of things a company might do to protect the privacy of their customers' data. Compliance tends to get driven by two different things. So there's regulation, like HIPAA compliance, for example. You get fined if you mishandle health records for patient data. And so the cost is, if you don't do the things in the compliance certification, you get punished for it. The other driver, and this is really interesting, especially in the last maybe 5 years or so, is market-driven compliance. And what I mean by that is that, so for security, the language of security reviews today is compliance. And what I mean by that is that if you're a company making your awesome SaaS tool and you want to go sell to another company, that company wants to make sure that your tool isn't going to leak their data all over the internet, and that you are practicing good security, for whatever good means, such that they can trust you with the sensitive data that they're giving you. And in the last 5-10 years or so, the security review process, like the language of that in the United States, has centered around a SOC 2 certification, which is a compliance standard that sort of outlines some high-level best practices in security. And when a buyer is evaluating a vendor, one of the things that they ask for is like, what is your SOC 2 certificate? And so what that signifies is that vendor has done enough of the things that SOC 2 sort of guides them to do, and has had an auditor come by and say, like, yes, this person is adhering to the controls that they've set themselves up for. And so as a vendor, if I want to do business with certain buyers, and increasingly more and more buyers, just given the focus on vendor security and the data breaches that we've seen, if I want to go play in that market, I need to go get a compliance certificate in order to do so.
Okay.
And the good news about that is that you as a vendor don't really need to keep up with certifications, because your customers will just tell you what they need and tell you what they want. I mean, it's very coarse, right? But the market sort of dictates the need, not just to go get a compliance certificate, but to do the necessary investments in compliance. And another thing that's really interesting too is that, maybe like in the mid 2010s, compliance was only really for enterprise companies selling to enterprise companies. But with the proliferation of, like, again, with the increased scrutiny on vendor reviews because of all the data breaches that we've seen, those needs for compliance standards are getting pushed down to smaller and smaller companies. And so a company that started a month ago and is trying to unblock their first deal with 2 people in a garage that is maybe even pre-product needs to invest in security in order to get a compliance certificate. And so the sorts of things that we're talking about earlier with investing in infrastructure as code, investing in code reviews and CI/CD and sort of those best practices that are good for productivity and security are getting pushed on organizations earlier, which is a good thing because the earlier you make investments in these sorts of foundational investments, the easier it is to do so and the more you can benefit from the dividends. But that's one thing that's really interesting is that compliance is getting pushed on security. Security compliance in particular is getting pushed on smaller and smaller companies.
Yeah. And so I'll give you a kind of related example, but so was recently talking to my accountant and we were just kind of, talking about some tax things and here in the United States, some folks need accountants, some don't. And, hey, when you have a side business, a lot of times you need an accountant. So I'm asking him some questions and it was the funniest thing. We were talking about how's everything going and how's the tax season been? And he made the comment, "Oh, it's been good, but it's really, really hard to find people right now." And I was like, "Oh, tell me a little bit about that," because it's not like tax accountants in the United States is a new profession by any means. But he said the problem was, and he said it's a post-COVID thing. No one wanted to come into the office, but he had a requirement. People had to come into the office because he said, I can't have folks in my firm taking our clients' information home and doing the tax records on their kitchen counter. He's like, it's not secure. It's not compliant. I don't know where it is. I can't guarantee it. And, this is just a small firm here in Raleigh. I'm like, oh, wow, I never even really thought about that. And I probably should have, but I never did.
Yeah, I think that the security in general has been moving more automated, more digital, less physical, less process and spreadsheets. And I think that COVID just massively accelerated that because all those sorts of questions around what is your work from home policy? How does the VPN work? Those became the rule, not the exception.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So let me kind of maybe even take that concept one step further, right? In security and compliance worlds, there's almost like 2 phases, or a minimum of 2 phases, 2 big buckets, if you will. Discovery, right? Like discovering you have a violation in some way, shape, or form. And then what are you going to do about it? How are you going to remediate it? And there's been a lot of, especially security tools out in the industry. One might specialize in one might specialize in the other. One might be a complete solution that does both discovery and remediation. Tell everyone a little bit about Vanta specifically, and how does Vanta work with organizations to solve for both the vectors, if possible?
So Vanta is a tool that helps our customers automate both building their security program and then demonstrating it to an auditor, to a vendor directly, et cetera. And in building that security program, what we do is we offer 200 plus, I think 230 these days, integrations that essentially pull data from a bunch of different systems that a company is using. And again, these are systems in the digital world, not the physical world. And we run tests against the information that we're pulling in those systems to identify potential security threats. And so there's this big dashboard of, here's a bunch of information that we know about your company. Here are the potential threats. Go dig into them. And here's some instructions on how you might remediate those threats. And once you've gotten your security program in pretty good shape, we also can present a dashboard to an auditor so that they can run their audit on your security program. We also can package things in trust reports, or which enable a vendor to see directly your security posture, not skipping the whole audit process. And so, talking a little bit more about what you called out the identification process versus the remediation process, the value in Vanta is pulling information from a bunch of different sources, automatically identifying security threats. And those security threats are not maybe specific to a specific integration. Like, we can pull information about your AWS configs and we can say, yes, this S3 bucket, which contains customer data, is public. Are you sure you want to do that? You don't? Okay. Well, then go to this config in the AWS console, change it to this to make it private. Or if you want to do this in Terraform, here's a little snippet for that.
Nice.
The real magic comes in the information that exists across multiple integrations. So for example, we can hook up to your GitHub account and see who has access to GitHub, who in your organization. We can also hook up to your HRIS and tell you and learn who is an employee at the company, when did they start, when did they leave, et cetera. And those are interesting independently, but together we can tell you who is no longer an employee at the company who has access to your sensitive IP in your code. And so the enriching the data that we're pulling such that we can run more sophisticated tests on it is significant value also that we provide. When it comes to remediation, as I said before, today that's like telling you what to do and directing you how to fix it and saying, hey, this is the best practice, do this if you want to adhere to it. In the future, you can see that there's a lot of interesting things we can do with automated remediation, right? Like rather than telling you that your S3 bucket is public, we can just like make sure that never happens in the first place. The bar is high on that, right? You have to make sure you're really correct. But that's not true for everything you can do. Like if there's someone who has access to your GitHub repository that's no longer a former employee, we could just automatically remove access from that account. So the remediation is a really interesting opportunity. It's one that we're pursuing, and there's a lot of considerations there too.
Fantastic. Let me kind of ask a follow-up question on that, because you mentioned 230 or more in integrations. How does a lot of the scope of that work typically come down to you specifically with engineering? Is it, customers ask for something and then you kind of go explore and have a team go do that? And does that take a dedicated team? Because, when I hear something like that, my solutions background, for an architecture background kind of goes, man, oh man, that's a lot of things to test and certify. And how do you keep up with something like that?
Yeah, we've built more than 150 this year. I think we're releasing 15 this week.
Wow. Yeah.
We're pushing really hard on this because of the value that automation provides, right? Like that's the superpower of Vanta. I think that like as a head of engineering, this is true sort of all the way down to the people, all the way down the entire org chart. We're very customer focused and very much plugged into hearing customer feedback directly rather than hearing it from a product manager, talking to customer facing teams to get a real deep sense of like what those customers' needs are and what their pain points are. We hop on calls with customers too to just get to really deeply understand from an engineering perspective and from a product perspective what we need to build and why. And so I think again, because of the strength of the value proposition of developing integrations, that's something that we hear a lot from customers, and that's something that we want to invest in order to meet that need.
Nice. And I'll take the automation question one step further, because automation these days is a no-brainer. Cloud-like operations at scale, it's what you got to do. But also the other, it seems like it's working its way into every single conversation now, is when and how does AI and ML impact something like this, like in the discovery and remediation parts, or, how do you foresee this playing in both maybe the short-term and long-term future?
Yeah. So this is super interesting because, as I was saying before, the world of security and, led by Vanta compliance is really driving more toward automation rather than paperwork and processes. And today there's so much paperwork in a lot of how security and compliance is done today, right? Like you're issuing policies, you're generating system diagrams for certain compliance certificates. In addition to a SOC 2 certificate in the US, companies are often answering security questionnaires. So you get a spreadsheet full of questions that you have to provide answers to. There's just like so much paperwork and manual work that happens here that AI can really just do a much better job of. And instead of reading an 80-page, in Vanta, if you're using Vanta to manage your vendors, instead of reading an 80-page SOC 2 report yourself, we can throw that in an LLM and do some interpretation and identify some areas that you and your company in particular would like to follow up on. Similarly, if somebody issues a security questionnaire asking you all sorts of questions about your security posture, we can just take the data in Vanta and answer those questionnaires for you. You don't have to spend a bunch of time in Excel to do that. Teams spend so much time doing that. And so there's an immediate benefit in just automating a lot of the schlep that happens today for security and compliance. In the future, though, we believe that security demonstration should not be done through paperwork and compliance certificates and things like that. A SOC 2 certificate is better than nothing, but because of the way it works, it's good for a year, so it could be up to a year old. It was audited by a human who make mistakes, who can't look at everything, who don't have perfect data. So there's a lot of opportunity here in automation for security demonstration too. It's not just about getting the piece of paper; it's about demonstrating your security posture in a real-time, live updating manner. And the role that AI has to play in that is both in sort of helping vendors assess their threats, right? Looking at all the data from hundreds of integrations that Vanta has to assess potential things and irregularities that they may want to dig into. And for a buyer to be able to look at high-level analysis of either of the vendors that they're using, or even in a specific vendor, if a buyer has lower level visibility into a company's security posture, they can sort of identify, hey, you were faster at remediating security threats 3 months ago than you are today. What's going on? And so I think that AI can certainly accelerate a lot of the manual work that happens today, but there's a lot of opportunity in the future to sort of go beyond as we move towards more automated ways to demonstrate a company's security posture and automated ways in that vendor review process to have a higher guarantee of security and trust between vendors and buyers.
Fantastic. That's awesome, Matt. Thank you. Now, I'm going to close this out. If folks want to learn more about the topics, learn more about Vanta, ask you more questions, where can folks dig in and learn more? And how do you suggest everyone get started?
Vanta has taken literally thousands of companies from I don't know anything about security and compliance to their first compliance certificate and getting their security program off the ground. That's not the only customers that we have, but especially as we got started, automating that compliance certificate journey was a big part of it. And so there's a ton of resources on Vanta's blog. We can link to it in the show notes, but vanta.com/resources. There are webinars, there are blog posts, either targeted towards a specific compliance standard, hey, my buyer's asking me for SOC 2, how do I even get started here? So there's sort of standard specific guidance, but there's also just guidance on how to get started with security programs and pragmatic ways to think about security, especially for startups.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Matt. I appreciate that. So with that, I'm going to close this out for this week. On behalf of myself and Brian, who wasn't able to make it this week, thank you everyone out there for listening. If you enjoy the show, please, please, please tell a friend. Please leave us a review if you're able to leave reviews wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, as always, please send us feedback as well. So with that, I'm going to close this out for this week, and we will talk to everyone next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.